As you've seen from my last line chart example, I was using D3 and integrated into React, and it's working well. However, I'm sort of doing a side effect because I'm ignoring React altogether. I'm not letting React control the DOM, which is really React's strong suit. So a better approach to take about this is really to allow React to control the DOM element instead of letting D3 take over completely, and for me to handle the redrawing. And that's exactly what we're going to do in this example. That I want you to kind of think about it a little bit differently. Instead of thinking of the component on its own, let's think about it as a widget, because usually when we're integrating D3 with React, it's more than just creating a chart. We have to think about the data, we got to think about other elements, maybe other components. So a good approach that I found was, if I start to think about it as a widget, and inside my widget I have a chart, I may have other component, then it really helped me to architect my chart in a way that it's going to be easy to understand and work with. So to do that, I set up two templates for you with Generate React App. And if you go into the widget folder and open the README, you're going to see an example of a D3 widget and chart. So if I want to create my line chart component and my widget, the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to create my widget component, and then I'm going to create my widget. So to create the widget component, I'm just going to use the type of D3 widget component, and the name of my component, it's going to be a line chart. And to create my widget, I'm just going to be using a type of D3 widget and the name of the widget. So npx generate react CLI component, and the component is going to be line chart widget. So that creates for us two components, and we can see them if we're going inside the source widget and the source component. So let's start from the widget. So, for the widget, it creates for us a SAS, a test file, and a widget, and a type already. For the type, if you open it, it has already two types. One of them is the data that we had before, and if you remember what we need to do a date, and we need to do a value. So if we're checking the date, if you remember, it was of type string, and the value was of type number. I'm just going to be using the same CSV we did before, that for the line chart. So you see we got a string and we got a number. And then we also have another type called dimension. The dimension is, I'm just setting a type that we can set all the width, the height, the margin, and the bound information in a variable. This way it's easy to kind of set it up, and you'll see in a little bit, because we're going to use it inside of a helper. So now that we set our type and we have our widget, let's take a look at the widget. Our widget, we need a few things to set up. Because we're using template, we can't, it's not a task runner that we can do as much, anything we want. I'm limited to the template. We need to set the chart we're going to be using. The chart we're going to be using, if you go to component, you'll see that we called it line chart. So I need to, instead of, this is just a generic, it says chart, but I need to put it myself that I'll be using the line chart. And I need to also set it up when I render the component. I need to make sure I'm using the line chart. And let's take a look at what we have here. oh wait, before that, I'm getting another error with the chart helper. So inside of the line chart, you'll see we have a sess file, a test file, a line chart tsx, and a line chart helper that we're going to cover in a little bit. But for now, let's just make sure that the imports are correct. So it has to be line chart, and it's line chart helper. Okay, so we don't get any errors. Let's see if the errors are gone. It's complaining about the data because we're not setting the data yet. So let's ignore this. I just want to show you the file first of all. The data is set in a use state. So this way I can keep a state of the data and I know if I load it or not. It's complaining here because I'm passing that my type should have been of the type that we set of date and value, but here I'm passing nothing. So what needs to happen really, every object has to have a date. So let's set the date is just nothing, and the value, I'll just set it as 0. So it just needs an initial value when it initializes. So I'm just passing one element and I'm passing it as, with date nothing and value 0, just so it won't give me errors. And then in terms of the width and the height, what I'm doing is, if you remember last time when we changed the width and the height, the component didn't resize, but in practical production level code, we want our component to resize. So what I've done is I created for you a hook. So if you look inside of the hook folder, I created a hook called Windows Dimension, and what does that hook does? It's attaching a reference to the window of the JavaScript DOM document, and it's going to listen to any changes of resize. So there's a use function hook here that listens to a resize Windows event, and when that happens, the width and height reference are going to change, and I can take advantage of it and change the chart width and height. So I just initialize it and I set the width and height, and now those properties can be used in our document. For the dimension, you saw that I created a type dimension that holds the width, the height, the margin, and the bound width. Those are settings that I can set up front, and that way what I'm doing here, if you see, I'm setting the dimension as a reference. I'm using use reference because what I want to do is I want to keep track of that if the dimensions are changing, I want to change the document as well. So this can be extracted to a parents document, to a context in React, however you want. The way we do it with reference, again, we use the dimension and we set the current. So the current dimension is going to be set to the width and height of the document that it's being passed to me from the use window dimension hook. It wants space here. Let's do that. And I'm doing it times 0.9, meaning I'm taking 90% of the width and I'm taking 90% of the height, and then I'm setting the left, right, top, and bottom padding to whatever values I want. So this is going to be my initial value for the dimension, and that dimension can be passed to all the charts in that widget or all the component in that widget. Now the next thing I need to do a resize use effect hook. So once there is a resize, so it's listening to the dependency of the width and height, and once there is a resize, then it's gonna change the current of the dimension to the new width and height. This should be 0.9 to match. Okay, so I'm matching. You see I got the width 0.9 and height 0.9. Once the width and the height is changing due, for example, that the user resizing his window, then I can make the changes to update my dimension. If you can see here, I'm changing actually you need to match it. So the left is 30, 50, 10, 20. 30 to the left, 50 to the right, 10 and 20. So I want to match those, and those can be also you can set them up. You can set them up as a constant, or you can pass them however you want to do it. Here I'm just baking them. And then the next thing I need to do is I need to load the data. So in the example before, if you remember, I loaded the data inside of my chart, but that's not a good design, because what if the same data is used for multiple components? Or what if we want to use some kind of state management like Redux or Recoil that we're going to use later, and we want to extract loading the data? So it's much better design architecture to kind of load that separately. In the load data, what I have here, this is just, I just put some code for you to kind of work with, but we need to change it because this is set D3 with JSON. We're not loading JSON. What we're loading is the same component we had before, which was a line CSV. So what we need to do is change it to line CSV, and we need to change from JSON to JSV like we had before. And the format is a little bit different between the JSON and the DSV. Here we had a then, but really what we did before in a previous component, if you remember, we did it differently. First we processed the data, and then we set it, and then we called the then to handle that. So the way we're going to do it, let's do it the same way. What we did before is we kind of took the DS, and then we attached an inline method that will handle processing the data. So what, and only then we can attach how we're going to handle after the data was processed. So what we can do is we can just, this time we can just return D as types data. And it's an array of type data, so we need to do that. And that's basically what it's going to do. It's going to set our each element of them, and then until it loads everything, and then it's going to return a data, and then we can handle the then function. In the then function, it's we can take that data, and the only thing we need to do is we need to set it for data. I'm seeing, you see that error here. I have one error because it expects the delimiter and then the URL. So I need to set the URL, and I need to set my delimiter. It's a CSV, so it's just going to be, I'm setting it with a comma, and hopefully that will take care of those errors. Still having errors. Let's see why. That's because my URL doesn't need to be in a bracket, and I need to set my function. Okay, now that works. Now it's complaining because it doesn't know the type, so we need to add a conversion to unknown and then to the type. Okay, so now we're loading the data and we're setting the data, and we have a use effect that checks the data length. So if the data length is less or equal 1, and it's going to be equal 1 because we set the initial value of our state with remember we set the initial value with a date and a value. So if it's basically we're saying here the use effect is going to check, and if the data is less or equal to 1, then it means that we didn't load the data, and we need to call the load data that we just set in order to load our data and set it. Okay, and then on the return we have a conditional function here that if the data length is greater than 1, which means that the data was loaded, then show our line chart. If it's not, show a message of loading. And this message is just text, but you can put a loader, you can put anything you want. This is just while we're loading the data, we want to show something on the screen. And then in our line chart, so widget is set up and ready, and then it's calling our line chart. What we want to do, the entry point app.tsx, we can add our widget. So we can call it here line chart widget. You can see the example from the last video I just commented out here. So I'm reusing the same base code that I did before. And here's our line chart widget. And inside of our line chart, we have it set up already with few things. We have the dimension type that we set and we can use. Then we have the data already set. And then we have another one property that I call properties name. And it's a string of array. And if you look at the widget again, you can see that we're passing property names. And this is just the default value that I set. But what we should be really passing is what are the properties out of the CSV that we're going to be using. In our case, we're going to be using the date and the value, right? So if you look at the CSV, you see we have the date and the value. Now, why did I extract it and put it here? The reason is that, for example, what if we want to use the same chart with a different value? So let's say our data set has different date set, or instead of the value, it has value for the volume. So, but we want to use the same chart. So for example, if we want to show the same date, but instead of showing the value, which is the price here, we want to show the volume, or we want to show other properties. We can set it up easily here and create a transition instead of creating another chart. So this is just a really good design that will allow us to kind of utilize binding and make sure we can update anything we want. And I'll show you those scenarios. We're gonna get to those scenarios. So we're passing already those two. Let's look at the line chart. We have some vanilla code built in already. So let's see what we have. We have a method that's checking, it's a use state that is checking if the data was loaded or not. And that way we can keep track if our chart was loaded or was not loaded. And if you scroll down to the use effect, you can see that it's being used here. In the use effect, we check in, hey, wait a second, is our chart was loaded? If it was not loaded, then what we need to do is we need to set the loaded state to true, because we're going to load it now. And we're going to call a callback to handle the first time we're loading the chart. And if it was loaded, then we just need to update the chart. This design is great because it allows us to process the chart in two steps. The first step is when we first load the chart, and the second step is when we want to do changes, or we want to do some kind of whatever changes we want to make to the chart. For example, we want to make a data change and we want to show this cool transition or anything we want. So breaking that process to two, we're really going to allow us to utilize React to the fullest. Now, I call those method memorized drawback and memorize update drawback. The reason that I call it memorize drawback is because I'm using the callback, so it's not going to be running it on the DOM every time. It's only going to run it, it's going to cache that. This way, we get to use really React to the fullest. So using a callback and caching that function will allow us to really use React to the fullest. Now, in my example before, I let D3 take over, but ideally what we want to do, we want to let React control our HTML and SVG element using JSX. This is because we can really let React decide when there is a need for an update, and that's going to really increase our optimization, and we will use the best of both worlds. We can use D3 for all the calculations and drawing and everything we need, and then we can use React to handle the DOM. The way we're going to do it is, instead of appending the elements using the D3 select and append, I can just write all those elements right in the JSX return. So to do that, we have, let's see what we have. We got a div, and inside the div, if you remember, we always need to put an SVG element. So I'll put an SVG element, and I'll give it an ID of a wrapper, because that's really what it does. It's a wrapper of our chart. So we got a div, now we got an SVG wrapper. Now we need to give the SVG the width, and we need to give it the height. For the width and the height, we use that dimension type that we passing through the properties, so we can just use the width from that. Let's collapse it so it's more organized. Okay, here we go. Okay, so look what we're doing. I'm passing the property of the dimension that we set from the parent component, and I'm passing the height, and those properties will change once the user is resizing, because it's binding to the hook that I set, and that way now we can handle that automatically. We don't even have to write code, you'll see. Then the next thing we want to do, let's see what's complaining. It says it can be self-closing because there's no tag inside yet. Okay, so let's add the tag. Now inside our wrapper, we can add another group that will hold our chart and our axis. I'll give it an ID of bounds, because that's going to be the bounds of our chart. And let's give it a style so we can transform it. So the style, just like we did before, we can transform it. To use style inside of JSX, you need to use the double brackets. I don't know if you've done this before, but this way it's you see, you can get the elements typing automatically. So we do the style of transform, and inside we can also still use the template style for the translate. So the translate is going to be the two dimension that we pass from the prop as well. So it's going to be the props of the dimension, again, of the margin to the left, just like we did before, and the margin to the top. And since we do it as a style, that's really the difference between a style and an attribute. In a style, you have to write pixel, and in an attribute, you don't need to write the pixel. Since we're using a style, we need to write the pixel. So we can use the same. I can copy this. So it's going to be the margin on the left and the margin on the top pixel. I close this. So far so good. Then inside of our G element, I can add the path with an ID. You guessed it, path. Let's close that. And this is going to be for the line. And we need two elements that will hold the x-axis. Let's close this. And another element for the y-axis. So basically what I did is, instead of using select and D3, I'm just creating all the elements that I need already in the renderer, and that will and I use ID so I can access them through D3, and I pass the properties of the dimension from the parent's component, so it's going to know when there's a change. Okay, since I disable, you can see there's an ES linked to disable next line for unused properties, we can take that off because we're using it and we're using the data, so we can take those comments out. So now we have the JSX. Now we need to draw a chart. And as I showed you, we got two methods to do it. We got the memorize drawback callback, and we have the memorize update callback. So we need to decide what do we want to do first and what do we want to do once there is a change. So that's really that's something that you can we can decide in the beginning, or we can decide later and move things around. You'll see as the code grow what we want to do. In our case, if we want to update our document, we can set certain things in the when you first run it, and then other things later on. So we can put most of the code once you update the callback, because it's going to recognize it immediately. So in this specific code, we don't really need to break the code into two, because we don't need to watch for the resizing. The resizing will happen automatically. What this means to us is that this design is the default that I set you up with the template. It doesn't mean you need to use that, because in this scenario, it's going to recognize immediately when there's a resize change. So what we can do is we can just keep the update, and we don't need to check if it's loaded. We don't need to check anything. And so this split design is not necessary in the case we have here. So what I can do is I can just keep the memorize update data, and I can get rid of the memorize drawback, because we're not going to do anything with it. What I am going to do, okay, so let's get rid of one of those methods, because I don't want to split it. It's not necessary. So I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to delete the loaded, because we don't need this either. Okay. Now we need to update the dependencies, and we can put a line breakpoint. You'll see that the use effect, it's going to be called only when we need it. Really, we only need to call it in one scenario, is once the data has changed, right? And we need the dependency of the callback. This way it won't call it on every use update. It's going to cache that. Okay. So now we got our method with the use callback, and for the scales, I created the helper automatically for you that's going to handle getting the scales. So what we're doing is, inside of the line chart helper, if you click that was also added with automatically for you with the template. We have a get scale method, and that get scale method, this is where we can define our scales. So instead of putting all that code here inside of our line chart, it's better to extract it to a helper, because it's easier to deal with it. So any accesses we need, any scales that we want to create, we can just set them up here. Now, if you remember, for the scales, we need to create an accessors. So if you look at this helper class, it's a class, and it has a readme only for an array of the metrics. The metrics was the properties that we're passing to the constructor, meaning when we set our helper, we need to set our accessors. So our accessors needs the property's name, right? If you remember how we did it the last time. So when we call our get scales, we need to pass the property's names. This way it can create a new instance of the helper and set the metrics, which was the property name, which will set for us our accessors. Now here I have two accessors, and they're mapped to the metrics, right? You see, it's the D, and the accessor would be the data, and it's using the D of the first metrics. For the X accessor, the first one would be the date, and for the Y accessor, it's going to be the value. So you can see how it's mapped here, and we can add as many accessors as we want. So here I left you a comment, for example, if we need to use a date parser, that in our case we do need a date parser because we're using a date, we can uncomment that, because also the parser, we can leave it here to make our code more organized. And our parser is being used in our Accessor, if you remember from last time. So what we need to do is we can just call that line helper. You can see I left you a comment here. That's how you're going to do it. You can really use this code. Take a look. And what it does, it's calling itself. It's calling because we're using static methods. So we're calling itself, we're calling the date parser, and we're passing the date as our accessor. And we're using the date parser. This way we can change the parsing right here. And it will set our X accessor. For the Y accessor, we don't need to do anything because the value is of type number. So we don't need to do any processing for that. Now, the only other things we need to set in the helper is we need to set our scales. So for the scales, we have two scales, and we can really go ahead and take them from the work we did in our previous components. So if you look at the basic line chart, we created two scales. We created the X scale and the line scale. The X scale, here it is. It was a scale of time, so I can just take that and paste it here. And for the Y scale, if you remember, we set it as a linear scale, and we can pass it here. Oops. From D3. Now we need to handle some of the errors. Okay, so the errors we have here, let's take a look. First of all, the width is okay. You see this entire code, we don't need this anymore because this whole code was the accessor. So all we need to do is we can call our helper, and we can call the X accessor, and that will pass in to the main. It's going to use the accessor. Same with the Y scale, we can just get rid of this entire code that it's really the Y accessor. So we can get rid of this entire code and just call helper Y accessor. And that will do, wait, I deleted too much code. We still need the data, and to map the data and use the accessor after mapping the data, right? So as you can see, and we need a comma here because we have, it's returning the scales. So you see how easy it was to just take the code we built in the basic line chart, and we just put it inside of our helper, and now it's not only reusable, it's really cleaning up our code. So if you look here, now we have a scale object that's hold our X and Y scales. Now to draw our chart, what we can do is let's make a little change, and what we can do is we can create a line. We can create a constant that will generate our line. So our lines are going to be equal to the D3, and use the line method just like we did before, and then we can use the X and the Y just like we did before. And what we can do is, let's put some spaces, it's easy to see, and then we can use the data. And now if you remember, what we need to do is we need to pass the X scale and the Y scale. So if we call scales from the function, now we have them available. See, we got the X scale and we have the Y scale. In order to get that the X scale, what we need to do, if you click on the X scale, it does expect to set few methods up, because what we need to do is we need to set the value of the data that we're going to be using. So what we need to do is we need to use the data as for both of them. So we need to use the data for the X scale and the Y scale. You can use the ignore as we did before, or you can just cast it to the correct way. The correct way should be first unknown, if you remember, and then of types data is date, because that's what D3 expect to handle. It's still complaining. It needs another unknown. Okay. So D3 as unknown. Let's see why it's complaining still. Let's keep asking for unknown. So that's obviously an error. So we got D as unknown as type data, because we need to close this in a bracket, as date. Okay. So see, it's this crazy casting that we can avoid the whole thing by just using the ignore. So what we can do is we can just set it just past the D. So as I said before, I really I don't think it's the best way to kind of make sure it's casting correctly, because just D3 is not really very TypeScript friendly. So it's better to just ignore those. Otherwise, we're going to have some crazy casting going on, as you've seen. Okay, so we got our two line added, and now what we know, now that we have those added, let's see, it's still complaining. Okay, so we have the, I think I deleted one of the, okay. And here too, I deleted one of the closing brackets. Okay, now it's working. So now we have that lines generator, let's call it LineGenerator, that we can use it inside of our D3, right? So what we can do, instead of append a path as we did before, now we have the path, we can just select it. So remember, we set the path right here in the JSX, so we don't need to append it. We just need to select it, and now that we have the path, we can set the same attribute that we did before. If you remember, we did a fill of none. We did a stroke of tomato. We use the D attribute, and here we could have just wrote the data here, but I split it so it's easy to kind of take a look and work with it. And it is complaining just like it did before. It's because of that overload that ESLint doesn't like we're doing, so I'm gonna TS ignore that as well. And let's take a look if it's working. It's look like I'm getting an error. Let's take a look. Okay, the reason I'm getting an error is that in the X scale, we need to use the accessor and then pass the date. So to do that, we need to set the accessor. So we can create a constant, call it helper, and then initialize the new helper class, so line chart helper, and pass our properties names, so that way we can use our accessors. So now we can use helper dot xAccessor, and then we can pass our data, and the same for the y. We need to use the helper dot yaxis and then pass the data element. Let's take a look. It's still complaining. Because our line generator, it's expecting the data to be passed. So we need to pass the data to our line generator. Let's take a look. Here we go. So you see we got our line, and let's take a look. Watch what's happening now. Now when I'm resizing my browser, it's actually resizing the line itself, and that's because right now we have React in charge of our DOM. Instead of before, we kind of created the side effect and we took over. If I put a line breakpoint to debug and see what's happening, so I'm running it now in debug mode. Just wait a second, it's going to load that. So if I'm running it in debug mode, we can see what's happening a little bit behind the hood. You can see we had the loading, and then it loaded the data. So you see we have the loading, then it called our line chart. The reason that it's called it is because our data got changed, you see? All the data kicked in, right? And now what happened when I'm going to resize, watch, I just resized, and my use effect hook got called, even though it wasn't part of my dependencies, just because it's being hooked through the JSX with the dimensions already set on our JSX code. So it's calling it automatically, and then when it's calling it, it's using our memorized update callback and redrawing our line chart with the changes that we made. So that's pretty cool. We didn't have to do a lot of work, and we really took full advantage of React in order to do resizing. Now the only thing we have left to do is to just create the peripherals. So for the peripherals, I'm using two things. I'm using, oops, I have a typo. It's good. For the peripherals, again, we have the YX and the XX. So for the YX, we can create a constant YX generator and use again the D3 axis to the left. And now we already have the scales, and we're using the Y scale, so our coding is really easy. And then what we need to do is we need to call the bound, we need to call the YX generator and attach it to the bounds. So the bounds, if you can see, I set them up here for us. So it's a D3 select of the bound, and the bound, that was the group that wrapped around our SVG that holds the path and the x-axis and the y-axis. So if I'm calling the bounds, and in the bound, I can actually, why doesn't it like that? Let's see. Okay, so in our bounds, what I can do is I can select the path element. No, I'm sorry, not the path element. I need to select the y-axis element, and then what I need to do is I need to call my y-axis generator. And of course TypeScript doesn't like that we're doing this overload, so just ignore that. You can set it in ESLint so it won't call that, but I prefer to leave it so I'm in control when I'm doing it and I'm aware that I'm doing that. So now that we set the y-axis, that should draw our y-axis. Let's take a look. Here we go. So it drew our y-axis, and you could see that also when I'm resizing, it's also resizing my y-axis because, again, React is in charge of the DOM. And now the last thing we need to do is we need to create the x-axis. So for the x-axis, again, we can create, just like we did before, an x-axis generator and use d3 bottom, and we need to pass the scale. In our case, we need the x scale. And now we need to call the, and now we can set our bounds and select this time the x-axis ID element, and we can call our generator, our x-axis generator. There you go. And we need to add the ts-ignore for the overload. And now let's take a look. Here we go. It puts it at the top because if you remember, last time we did a translate to put it at the bottom. So we need to do the same thing. So what we need to do is we need to add a style of transform and then use the translate to position our chart to put the x-axis at the height of our chart. So what we want to do is we want to really transform and only translate the y and set it at the props dimension and at the bound height. So I'm setting it at the bound height, and if you remember, because I'm using a style and not an attribute, I need to add the pixel. So let's take a look. There you go. So now it moves it down here. Another thing we can do to refactor, look at the position of those x-axis are overlaying each other, and we can do something about that if we go back to the helper and to the scale, and we look at the x scale. A little trick that D3 has, if you do dot, you see it has a nice, and what the nice does, just like the name suggests, it decides how to handle that. So you can see the beginning, it gives us the year, so it's kind of organized a little bit better so we know the beginning of the year, and we can do the same for y-axis. So we can use the nice. I don't think it's going to make any changes in this chart. Yeah, I see, just organize it a little bit better.